Welcome, everybody. I'm Devrim Ersahin, and my co-presenter, Dr. Catanzano, is going to be joining in just a couple minutes. Together, we'll be talking about some generational communication differences among current workforce. And we have nothing to disclose relevant to this topic. So our objectives are to review generational characteristics, differences between generations. We will then discuss preferred generational communications. We'll give a couple of scenario-based strategies to improve multi-generational communication, and we'll talk about some challenges. So currently in the workforce, we have four major generations. These are not the only generations currently around us, but these are the generations either in the workforce or potentially coming into the workforce. So let's talk about some characteristics. We're going to make a lot of generalizations, a lot of assumptions. Obviously, there are going to be some differences, some outliers and exceptions. So this is just to give a general idea about each generation. So let's start with Generation Z. These people are currently like teenagers, people in their early 20s. So not really in the workforce, especially in a healthcare environment, but they're coming. They're probably the college students around you or medical students around you. So we don't know much about their workforce behavior yet, but they're coming. So this generation is very technology driven, right? Just picture the teenager in your house. Like they have the TikTok, they have the Instagram, they have multiple electronics, multiple apps. So they can multitask with all these electronics. But that results in short attention span. So you have to keep this in mind when communicating with this generation. So they have hard staying focused on one thing, but they are very image focused because of all these apps, documents, images around them. This generation values authenticity a lot. This is the generation that talks about identity, diversity, tolerance. They focus on multicultural issues a lot. And they are very interested in self-expression. But interestingly, they're very practical, despite all of these stimulations around them. They're not into frills. They're very practical people. Next, we'll talk about Generation Y, also known as the millennials. This is the most prevalent generation in current workforce. This includes all kinds of work environments, not just healthcare. Typically, people are in their late 20s or 30s. So typically, this is the resident next to you or fellow or maybe young faculty. So this is Generation Y or millennials. And they are called the Peter Pan generation because they're kind of slow in adulting. And Time magazine actually called them me generation because they tend to be more self-centered. This generation sees the world as a 24/7 environment. They want to access everything all the time, whenever they need information. They also want constant feedback, especially in a work environment. They value transparency. They value flexibility. And they're very confident, entitled, but they're also typically more depressed compared to other generations. They want to be involved in decision-making processes. So that's why the transparency for them is very important. But this generation is very successful. They're very driven, but their interpersonal relationships are not that great because they grew up with all the technology. So for communication, they use the social media, the phones more than face-to-face interaction. So their interpersonal skills are poor compared to other generations. This generation values lifestyle more than the work or money. And again, digital environment for them is their natural environment. They're digital natives. Next generation is the Generation X or in between generation or the latchkey kids. These people are late 30s to 40s typically, and they are estimated to be about 30% of the workforce currently. This is a generation that experienced divorce more than the previous generation. So hence, they are usually raised by single parents or both parents working. So hence the name latchkey. They would come home from school and go outside and play with their friends. This generation embraced the cohabitation. So they delayed marriage and they focused on themselves and career. And this generation typically likes to be in a more structured environment. They like to be given directions. They like certain set rules and they can follow the rules. But they don't like status quo. For this generation, work-life balance is important. And they also like, in a typical work environment, they like both physical and mental space to feel comfortable in the workplace. They like autonomy, like Generation Y. They like to be given feedback, and they see everybody as equals. For this generation, digital environment and electronics and everything we talked about for Generation Y, they learned them as they were growing up. So they're digital immigrants. So they're comfortable using all these tools, but most of them didn't exist when they were born. The boomer or baby boomer generation is the most experienced people in our work environment. They are typically in their 50s to all the way up to 74, 75. Usually they could be your boss, the chair or section chief because of all the expense they have. This generation values relationships more than any other generation. They are goal-centric. For them, work is or job is the most important thing. It's more important than anything else in their lives. Very resourceful. You can go to them for anything whenever you need something, job. And they prefer in-person communication. That's how they learned, how they grew up. And because of that, their interpersonal skills are very strong. Typically, they provide high quality products in a work environment, but they expect the same from other people. So their expectations are high. And these people are not afraid to question authority because they grew up in the 60s and it's not something they're afraid to do. As you can see, the year you were born or the years you were growing up in, the events that happened when you were growing up shape how you communicate with people, because those things change the values and the norms you grow up with. So it's very important to understand these basic differences between generations. So next, we're going to talk about some preferred communication methods among different generations. So Dr. Catanzano is here, so I'm going to hand it over to her.
Thank you, Devrim. We're going to move on to talking about generational communication preferences. And I think that this is really important. We've heard about what the generations look like in terms of their expected characteristics, but understanding how they see things and through what lens they see things and what their preferred communication style is really important. I think is often a source of frustration for many, because if you think about things like messaging or communication or feedback, you as the provider of that message or communication or feedback may think that you have actually communicated to someone, and you might be quite surprised when you hear back from the individual who's the recipient that, no, you didn't tell me this. Well, I think a lot of that can be explained by understanding that people see things through their generational lenses and also through their preferred communication style. So what you might think is an effective communication may not be received on the other end that way. So if we look at Generation Z, which is becoming ever so increasing in numbers and one of my favorite things to talk about, quite frankly, we can understand through their lens, understanding how they grew up, some of the situations that they found themselves in, and the massive increase in technology that really has defined a good portion of their lives, why they act the way they do and how they communicate. So I have a 13-year-old son. Anybody on this call who has kids in that age range can really appreciate this. Their attention spans are nanoseconds. They have very, very brief attention spans. They cannot focus on things for long durations of time at high mental capacity. That's just not how they grew up. If you think about what they look like when they are doing any activity, how many of you have seen this? They have the iPhone in one hand, their iPad in their lap, they're streaming YouTube on their computer screen, and the television or music is on in the background. That's how they act. That's how they communicate. They like to use multiple screens. They have lots of sensory inputs from different methods. If you think about some of their preferred vehicles of communication, they love TikTok. I know that that's been in the news a lot lately with, how many users they have. Instagram has really become their go-to platform. Twitter, as we'll see, is really a Generation Y and is more for the work environment, but they prefer these videos, messaging in picture and image format. They like Instagram, where you can tell a story through your images, very little need for text. They want their information instantaneously. So the way they get it is they just can access any of these devices that are in their hands or on their laps, and they will get their information instantly. And that is how they expect it. They make their decisions in the moment based on the instantaneous information that they are able to glean. And they want it to be concise and crisp and visual. They want to see something pop up on their screen like this telling me that we are now talking about Generation Z. They don't want to hear that you have slides with lots and lots of words. That is not how they communicate. What they prefer is sound bites. So that's when you are listening to the radio and something pops on for 10 seconds saying that we are having a party today. That's all they want to know. So they prefer to have very abbreviated pieces of information on which to base their activities, their interactions, and their decision making. They don't want to see paragraphs of prose. Even if they looked at the screen, they would probably hate this because there's just too many words on the screen. They like to text over talking. How many of you with the teenagers? I no longer yell upstairs to my kid. I just text him and I get an instantaneous response, whereas I might be calling him over and over again to finally get him to acknowledge that I am trying to get his attention. This is this generation. That is what they prefer to do. Having said that, even though they like to have this constant input of information to them and this constant stream with different avenues, they prefer to have their communication be extremely personalized. That is one of the characteristics of this generation. They want everything to be all about them, what they want to hear, how they want to hear it. So you can imagine the challenges of communicating with a generation that wants to have multiple ways to get that information from you, but all personalized to how they feel in the moment. That's quite the challenge. So they are a unique generation that we are just really starting to learn about as they're starting to hit our training programs now. Although we do have some cuspers who are at the tail end of Generation Y who have a lot of characteristics of Generation Z. And that is not uncommon in the later stages of a generation because these numbers are relatively arbitrarily defined as to what constitutes a generation. And they are really only done in retrospect. So the next generation is happening now, but no one has codified it, given it a name, but it is happening now and will be defined in the future. So if we look at Generation Y, they are a very different generation because of how they grew up. They are people who really like to engage in conversation. They are active participants in things. If you think about what they are all about, they love teamwork. They're all about making a difference as a group. They're about equality and equity and having everybody engaged and involved. So their messaging is different. When they get messages, they want to understand how to put it in the context of how they think, what their lens is. So when you're framing messages to this generation, you really do want to put them in the format of appealing to their sense of teamwork, to the value and meaning of the activity, so that it resonates with them and they can get behind the activity, get behind the message, and really internalize it. And because they are these digital natives, they are actually relatively fluid in a whole variety of different communication vehicles. So you can text them or email them. You can use these different apps like WhatsApp or Viber or any of those, or you can use social media posts like TikTok or Twitter or Instagram. They're more of the Twitter generation than the Instagram, but they are sort of moving in that generation. But you can also have a conversation with them. You can send them an email or pick up the phone, and they will embrace some of those interactions. So those of us in Gen X are different. This generation likes small talk. So they will start with the social niceties in any of the communications that you have with them. So they will pick up the phone and say, hi, how are you doing? How's your kid? What did you do this weekend? They like to have that interpersonal interaction and that communication vehicle to start to set the stage of a communication or a message or a need to do something. They want the direct communication in close proximity to the event. So if you tell them that they have to start reading a study on Monday, they want to know about it on Sunday, and they want to know exactly what they have to do. So you have to give them that information close to the time where you're going to be engaging in the event. And because they are prone to liking this small talk and are really very interested in this work-life balance, a lot of their communication will be very fluid between personal communication and life and sharing information and their professional lives. So you will not surprisingly have a conversation with a Gen Xer who will say to you, my daughter just danced in the latest Irish dance competition. And oh, by the way, we have to do this, this, and this for work. Our lists are out of control. Oh, and how is your son doing with his baseball team? They like that combination of interpersonal relationships, small talk, conversation personally, and they can communicate that way. They find email an acceptable way to communicate, although that may be changing as email boxes become flooded with just an enormous volume of data. But they very often will prefer the phone call or the face-to-face conversation. They are facile with some of the more emerging technologies, but they are digital immigrants. And so that may not be their first choice. If you said to me that I had to provide feedback to somebody over WhatsApp, I might actually not provide it just because that's not natural to me, but others might be able to navigate that a little bit better. And if we think about boomers, who are often the leaders at institutions like ours, these are people who really like to work in teams, but they have a much more defined and rigid top-down type of expectation. So they expect the communication to be unidirectional, coming from the top down. They don't expect to be receiving information back from those communications. They are people who prefer those one-on-one conversations. So this is the person that you're going to go walk down the hallway to their office to have a conversation, or tell them that they need to do an activity, or to tell them that you have to have them do something for work. They prefer these one-on-one and frankly in-person conversations. They will accept the telephone conversations, but they are certainly not their preferred. And they just don't like to have meetings. They are the get ahead with the day, let's get going. We don't really need these interactions. We just want to do our work of the day and get it done and accomplish things. So they are not going to be big fans of meetings. They will use technology, but generally it is going to be more for work-related or productivity-related activities. Think about all the people who are of this generation that you have had to force to work on Cortex lately. They will use it because they have to for their work, but they will never send you a message just to chat through these productivity applications. And they really need to feel valued for their input. They really value what they do and their place in the workplace. And so when you're messaging them, you really do need to make sure that you put up right out in front there that they are very valued members of the teams, that you really do value what they have to contribute to a conversation. And it's not all about telling them what to do. I think that should be frankly held for every generation, but that is specifically true for this generation. And they really are very work-centric. They are not going to be the people who tell you, oh, my grandson just walked today, unless you specifically ask them. So they don't feel that need to have the small talk or the interpersonal relationships. It really, for them, is all about the job. And how you frame your messages is extraordinarily important. It's not just the delivery vehicle for these different generations, but you've seen that they see their messaging through very, very different lenses. They always take the message and the content of a message, irregardless of the vehicle, but they take that content and they look at it through their lens. Is this important to them? Why are they involved? Do they need to know it? Is this something that they will be responsive to? So you really do have to think about what you're messaging, who you're messaging it to, how you would do that so that it is received and be internalized. So you really do have to make it so that they understand the value of the message to them through their lens. So now we're going to look at a couple of scenarios about how we could apply this in real life.
So again, in a work environment, you're going to have people from all of these generations we talked about. So it's almost impossible to use a single tool to communicate with everybody. So we'll give a couple of examples based on some scenarios. So you have a hospital-based department, and you have about 50 faculty and 60 millennial or Generation Y trainees in your department. And the age range for faculty is quite wide, let's say from 32, so Generation Y to Boomer. So you have people from all these generations, and everybody has an institutional email, but there's no centralized communication board. Again, the communication is going to require a multi-pronged approach, and you just have to accept effective communication with everybody will just not happen. First scenario, faculty and residents will be redeployed to clinical care areas to care for COVID positive patients. I'm sure a lot of us experienced this during the beginning of pandemic. So this is not really an urgent communication that needs to happen, but you have to find a way to let people in your department know. So if you have Generation Z, this needs to be an image-rich text message. You could probably use social media, but not in this scenario. But it doesn't have to have a lot of detail. You just tell them radiology residents being redeployed to COVID care areas, further details to come. Very short, very small text with an image-rich background. For Generation Y, again, it can be a text message, but for Generation Y, they need to understand, right? They need to be involved. They need to have transparency. So they will have questions. So you have to let them know that there may be a meeting or something like that for them to ask questions and understand the reason why the radiology residents are being redeployed. So a brief text again, radiology residents being redeployed to COVID care areas. There's going to be a town hall meeting for questions. For Generation X, this can be a discussion during a faculty meeting, or you can send them an email message saying radiologists redeploying to COVID care areas. Again, remember, Generation X needs a structure. They need to have rules to follow. So for them, you may have to include that training information so that they understand they're going to, at least they care for COVID patients, they have gone through training. And for questions, you can just let them know they can talk to the chair if they have concerns. But the communication with someone from the boomer generation is going to be different. It needs to be a phone call, or if they have an office next to yours, you can just stop by and have face-to-face conversation. But this message on the phone call should include some keywords, because remember, the job is very important for them. So if you let them know they are needed, it's going to be an easier conversation. So, Steve, we need to deploy you to a COVID care area. The patients need us. And how can I help you meet this need? Second scenario is a more urgent communication needed here. So one of the radiologists covering an outpatient center is out sick. The team needs to be shuffled before the first intravenous contrast injection patient. You have to, now that the communication is more urgent. For a Generation Z, again, a text message with an image-rich background, very brief, not a lot of words, CT reader out, patients waiting for contrast, please cover X location now. So that should be enough. But a Generation Y needs to understand, again, why they are being sent to a different location. A text message, CT reader out, cover X location now so patients not delayed. So you're explaining why they need to cover X location. For someone from Generation X, remember we said Generation X is in between generations, so any communication method would be okay for Generation X person, but because of urgency of this, you can probably page them saying CT reader out, coverage needed for waiting contrast patients, and please go to X location now. And boomer, again, just let them know they're needed. CT phone call, CT reader is out. I need your help covering injections at X location. Is that okay with you? They need to know their values, like this last sentence lets them know. Here, I'm going to hand it back over to Tara to talk about some challenges.
Great, thank you. So we all know that communication poses a lot of challenges for us, and very often it's like walking a tightrope between the way that we need to send out messages, the way we need to receive messages, how we should frame our content. It really can be very difficult to really be that central communicator between multiple generations, which we now see in the workplace, the likes of which we've never seen before, that we now have 4 generations working in our workplace. So how do you really approach this so that you are providing the information that is needed in a way that it can be understood, internalized, and received well by the people that you're trying to get it to? And it's really hard. And I think, unfortunately, many of the Generation X people are the ones in the middle of this. I should really put another Gen Z over there because we are starting to see them in the workplace. But, in the last couple of years, really, Gen X has been the central recipient of a lot of this communication challenge because they are trying to be that link between what their bosses, who are the boomers, are expecting of them and communicating down to them, being the person to communicate it down to the group below them for the Gen Y and now the Gen Z, and also to be receiving information and input from Gen Z in a way that they can understand as Gen Xers and then communicate that up to the boomers. That is really hard to do. And that's one of the reasons that this middle management group really does struggle with their roles and being able to operationalize all of these communication challenges. Generation Y is also a challenge in terms of receiving input back from them. So you may have a streamlined process by which you are pushing out the information. So, as a Gen Xer, you might be preferentially sending information through email, and that's how you expect to receive it. Well, Generation Y doesn't think like that. So because they are these digital natives, they are very comfortable with operating in all of these different systems in different communication vehicles at any given point in time as their mood strikes them. So they may choose to communicate with you or respond to a communication from you by giving you a text message, or they might send you an email. Somewhat less likely. They might send it to you in an application like WhatsApp. They might actually pick up the phone, also less likely. But that creates an enormous challenge for the recipient of this information. So if you think about it as a central person in a department, so let's say a residency coordinator, and we certainly have struggled with this, if you send out a message and say, I need this information from all of you by 5 p.m. tonight, and this person decides that they're going to send it to you in WhatsApp. That person's going to core text it to you. This person's going to give you a phone call. This person's going to email you. The third person's going to stop by your office. How on earth do you keep track of all of those responses? That is a tremendous challenge for communication and also for receiving input of information. So I think that this is something that we have faced certainly in the last couple of years with COVID. And I think that this is only going to worsen as that personalized approach that Generation Z is so very fond of comes into play, because they're going to want to respond to you in any way that they choose. And I think it's going to be important for departments and programs and work environments to really be very clear about the acceptable response mechanism so that there isn't information lost, especially vital information. And that is really important in the healthcare system with patient care activities that we are all engaged in. So I think it's going to be important as we go forward to have a unified approach in your department to, this is how we're going to communicate. And it's okay to communicate, I think, in different vehicles to make sure that the message lands appropriately with each of those individuals and those generations. But I think there should be a unified response mechanism. We are only going to accept responses to this communication via email. That will hopefully take away some of the opportunity for information loss that is such a real risk in this generational divide. So again, this is really the money shot in it. And if you don't take anything else away from this presentation, really, I want you to understand that how you communicate is really key. It needs to be in that form that sits with the recipient in a way that they can understand, because if you don't put it out there in a way that they can understand and receive it and internalize it, it's going to be like it never happened. We all have our own preferences for how we communicate. Gen X has our own preferences. Gen Y and Z have their preferences. And if you're not sure what they prefer, ask them. I think building these relationships and making sure that you have that discussion to say, you know what, I prefer to communicate with you on this case by text message. Are you okay with that? And they may say yes or no. And if they say no, say, okay, how would you prefer I do it? Do you want me to pick up the phone? Do you want to come down to my office? It's okay to ask. You don't have to just make assumptions based on the way you prefer to operate or the way you think they prefer to operate. Go ahead and ask the question. And feedback, I just want to touch on briefly, because I think that this is so important in terms of how you communicate. And we all face feedback challenges, not just with our trainees, but also with others in our work environment. So I just want to touch on this a little bit in terms of the communication approaches. So it just goes back again to this whole concept of the giver and receiver of the communication or the feedback. So if you are the giver of communication, you might like to pick up the phone or send an email to the learner or to the technologist or to the nurse to give them the feedback that they did something either really well or that they did something that could really use some improvement or that there was an error in it. So you, as the giver, may just pick up the phone and tell them this or send them an email and expect that they're going to understand that that is feedback and that it is formative, that they need to either improve their performance or that they should keep doing what they've done. But what might the recipient say? Oh, they just gave me some information. Okay, fine. They may discount it. They may not recognize that as important communication or feedback. So you think you've done a great job providing them this information. You've been very detailed in the information. You've used the SMART goals of being specific, have actionable and measurable items, but they may not even recognize that that is what you have done for them. So you have to think about what their communication preferences might be. If you are to give that same information, but to do it in a text message or using one of the apps that they are so very fond of, or using it in a Zoom meeting, you might actually get better traction of your message because they can internalize it. They recognize it as, oh, they're giving me feedback, or, oh, this is an important message. But that in itself is challenging because we are not always equipped to do this because of our own generational lenses. So we may think that in-person feedback is the best, but it's really hard to do in our disrupted and dysregulated, decentralized workflows. And this is a completely new world. We don't really know how this is all going to play out over time. This is constant iteration as we are trying to understand all of these different generations in the workforce, how we communicate with them, how we communicate with them in very decentralized ways when they're not necessarily in the same room or the same building, that we can use all of these different approaches with them, that we may just need to choose one tact of how to communicate with them. And it's going to take us practice. We really do need to continue to iterate, to learn from what effectively worked. So where did we get our message through? Where were we successful? What mechanisms did we use? How did we phrase that? To what didn't work? Like, I told you that, why didn't you do it? Well, okay, let's go back and debrief on this and think about what did we do right or wrong, or what did we do generationally or not. The generational differences are really key here. I think that one of the things that we struggle with, and I think we're going to see more and more of, is that feedback for the generation Y and Z has sort of been more in their growing up as the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. Everyone gets a prize, everyone does a good job. They haven't necessarily heard negative feedback in the past. And so when they come to us, either as new hires or as new technologists or as new nurses, they may never have experienced somebody correcting something that they did, or being displeased with them because they've made an error, or because, or giving them information that they were wrong. They may never have dealt with that. So this is a real challenge, both from the feedback perspective and from the communication perspective. And I think, again, we're going to have to learn how to manage that. And managing expectations about the feedback and communication frequency is also something challenging. Generation X, we grew up with the no news is good news approach. Generation Y and Z want constant, instantaneous feedback. So managing expectations within your groups is really going to be important. Gen X probably has to step it up a little bit and provide more feedback and communication. And maybe Gen Y and Z need to scale it back with what they're expecting from us. So those are ongoing battles that I think we do need to continue to look at. No talk is complete without this guy. I think COVID certainly was a game changer for how we communicated, how we messaged, how we looked at what our expectations were from generations. So you've heard a lot from us now about what the preferred communication methods are, but we may all be surprised because I think we are starting to see a little bit of flux with how the generations are actually expecting their communication. Gen Z, from feedback I've heard recently, is preferring in-person communication, which is not what we would expect from people who have their cell phones when they're sleeping at night, right? So COVID may have changed that. Gen Y is maybe more about in-person communication and email. Now, text me. Do not pick up a phone and call me ever, right? So that's what the Gen X is saying. And the boomers are getting really good at text messages and Zoom. So I think that we have started to see some changes in all of this. And Generation C is something that is actually what CNN has quoted as sort of the next generation. I remember I mentioned that generations aren't often codified until after the generation is over. I think that this is the next generation. This is going to be one of the defining moments for them. It is going to be a central component of how they grew up. We're already starting to hear about things like lack of socialization in preschool kids who never had an opportunity to go to school and interact with each other. So we are certainly going to see changes in communication and behaviors based on this experience. And we'll see it in our patient care populations, we'll see it in our trainees, we'll see it in our new hires. And we're also starting to see it in ourselves, as I've mentioned, with it changing really the way we approach how we communicate and how we interact. So more on this to come as this gets fleshed out in the next iteration of what this generation looks like. But I do think we need to be aware of it. And so that is the end of what we were planning to discuss. We've reviewed some generational characteristics. We talked about our preferred communication methods, gave you some communication examples, and we provided you with some wonderful challenges that we are all going to experience. So with that, we are going to conclude.